Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 Podcast, the show for readers of science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This is Season 1, Episode 25. In this episode, I'm joined by Mara to talk about inspirational romance and the recent controversy surrounding the Vivian Award and the RWA, Romance Writers Association. Mara is on YouTube as Books Like Woe, talking about books, and also has her own podcast, Changeling Cast, where she's been going through every book in the Side Changeling series by Nalini Singh, which is great. You can find both of those things linked in the show notes. If you guys enjoy the podcast, I'd appreciate if you take a moment to rate and review us so we can continue to reach more listeners. And if you're interested in getting early access to episodes, as well as exclusive bonus content with all of our guests, consider supporting us on Patreon. Huge thanks to all of our supporting patrons, including our world-expanding patron, Trina. You all make this possible. Mara, thank you for joining me to talk about this today. It's gonna be...
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot to talk about here. We've kind of both been on a live stream discussing this in more detail of like the timeline of what happened. So I will link that down below for anybody who wants a more deep dive with some other people as well into exactly what all happened. I don't know that we're going to get into all the details here, but
we were also together. We saw the news together. So
that's true.
This is like our third encounter on this topic together.
It's true. I mean, there's just so much to talk about. And I feel like you're particularly a good person to have to talk about this because of your background. So maybe to sort of set the stage, we'll do this in two pieces. First, maybe we can talk about each of our backgrounds with the topic and why this is of interest, and then kind of a brief overview of what happened and why there's discussion around this.
So I grew up, actually, my parents were not fundamentalists, but it's a long story. Basically, they sent me to fundamentalist evangelical school. So in terms of like my main influence in my faith journey, it was fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. So that is definitely kind of the faith tradition I have come out of. I sort of hit, I don't think at the time I realized it, but in retrospect, I was having sort of a crisis of faith coming out of university and into my early 20s. So I actually ended up putting my like technology consultant career on hold to go get a master's of religion, basically. And my focus dissertation was on essentially inspirational romance. Like, why is this a thing was kind of the question. And I used Jane Eyre kind of as a example of a very theologically motivated romance, and kind of was discussing why, you know, clearly it's possible to have a romance that is very deeply spiritual, like completely filled with Christian imagery, Christian themes, etc., but that is like a great work of art, versus kind of what most inspirational romance has, kind of the journey that genre has taken. That was kind of the area of discussion. So all that to say, inspirational romance definitely has been a big part of sort of like my overall thought life on romance. And I should disclaim, I don't identify as an evangelical anymore. Probably Christian agnostic be the best label for me. So just to kind of put that out there of, you know, I know certain points of view would see that transition out of evangelicalism as sort of negating any authority I have to talk about this. So I just want to go ahead and put that out there and let people draw what conclusions they will.
Yes. And so for me, I guess there's two pieces to this that I think are relevant to our conversation today. One is I did grow up in a conservative evangelical household. My parents were. I went to an evangelical Christian school for several years and was very much raised in that tradition. I also would no longer consider myself that. I do still identify as a Christian, but a fairly liberal, progressive Christian. And, you know, it's been interesting because Christian inspirational romance I read a lot of as a teenager. And I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that, so we'll get into it. And I went back to them a couple of years ago for a video project on my main YouTube channel, rereading them, and it was very interesting. The experience. And again, we can get into all of the details of like what you find in inspirational romance and what some of our problems with it are. Not all inspirational romance, which again, we'll clarify a little bit, but so that's part of my background and why this is something I find to be of interest. The other part of this is that a lot of the reason this is coming up in discussion right now is because of some things we're going to talk about that happened with the first Vivian Award with the RWA. And I was a judge for the Vivian. I did not read for the inspirational romance category, but there were some other problems with the judging process as well. I documented that in a vlog, again, on my YouTube channel, Beautifully Bookish Bethany, if anyone wants to see that saga of six months. Ooh, it was
suffered. I mean, you would DM me and just, I mean, if people consume Bethany's content, they know, she's a pretty positive person. She tries to find like good things to say about almost anything she reads, which, that's just kind of her approach. But she was truly unhappy for a good portion of that entire process because it just was not. It was not all rainbows and sunshine in the Vivian judging land for you.
Oh man, it really wasn't. It was rough. I mean, there were a few really good ones that I read, but it was rough. I know some of the people who do follow me and know that were very excited to see me get angry about books because it's not something I do very often.
So, it's not an everyday thing, but
No, but
it's enjoyable when it comes around.
Yeah, okay, so maybe we can lay out a little bit of background of what is the Vivian, what happens, and I can kind of start with this, and if you want to jump in, and we won't get into all the nitty-gritty because it's complicated, but
yeah, I mean, it's a lot has happened over the years with the RWA and these awards. We would be here for quite some time. So maybe we can just restrict ourselves to like specifically the history pertinent to the inspirational category.
Right. So the reason the Vivian exists as a new award is because the RWA has had problems in the past with diversity and representation. And so they said, well, we're just going to scrap our previous award. We'll start a new one to fix this problem, which was not fixed. I mean, we could talk about like that's a whole other issue. Broadly, it wasn't fixed, but particularly like the height of this being a problem was with the inspirational romance category. And this, I think, before had been called what because they changed the title of it, right? It was like it used to be inspirational romance and they changed it to romance with religious themes, trying to broaden it.
Yeah, I think the thought was this branches into the whole history of inspirational romance, which maybe we can save for later. But basically, like, I think they were trying to say like, hey, this doesn't have to just be evangelicalism. This could be any kind of religious tradition, like books that have big themes around that, I think was the thought process.
Yeah. I don't know how well that worked out for them, but I think that was the idea. And so there had been all this conversation around, okay, we're going to be more inclusive, we're going to be more diverse and more sensitive in how we do things. And then they released the finalists for the categories. They go through 3 rounds of judging. After the second round, they release the finalists. And in the inspirational romance category, one of the finalists was a book called At Love's Command. And in the prologue of the book, I believe it's the prologue, we find out that the man who's going to be our hero participated in genocide of Indigenous Americans, like Native Americans, Indigenous people.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
which is a lot. It's a lot. A big note to start your happy ever after story on.
Yes.
Yeah. A heavy place to start.
Oh man, it's rough. And I haven't read the entire book. I have read some excerpts from the early part of it a little bit. And
that's a good point. We should disclaim. So we have not read
it in its entirety.
So Again, if that disqualifies us from discussing this, then you probably aren't even listening to this, but you know.
Probably not.
We'll put it out there.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I have read thoughts from people who did read the entire book, so I've read reviews of it from
I read the prologue, but I didn't read the whole book.
No, same. But yeah, so the prologue begins with this, with genocide, and partially blames the indigenous people, which is...
Yeah, I mean, pretty directly, I felt like.
Yeah. And from what I understand, not direct knowledge, but from what I understand from what people have said, the hero ultimately isn't really even remorseful, and we can get into like the history of what this is supposed to be, and, you know, but isn't really even remorseful for what he did. He just feels bad that they had to kill women and children.
And I did see that quoted, so possibly that was misquoted, but the quotes that I saw floating around suggested it wasn't like, oh man, like upon reflection of my actions, like I see that this was awful and I was participating in like, you know, destroying a culture or I mean, you know, again, I know people get hung up on historical accuracy, which is like, you know how I feel about that. Yeah. Like, again, I have a whole video essay about why I think that's such a problem. But, you know, I can get if you wanted to put it in different kind of language, but there was no, from the quotes I saw, there was no signaling from the author kind of outside of the text that she had awareness that what she had depicted on the page was genocide. Like, it seems like neither the characters had that kind of awareness, nor did the author sort of metatextually signal to the reader, like, hey, reader in 2021, I know that you know that this is not good. So we're on the same page there, and these characters are like going on a journey. That didn't really seem to be the tone.
No. Yeah. So this gets announced back in, I mean, what was it, April? Beginning of May?
I mean, we've been hearing about this book since the spring. Yeah. It's been a few months.
Yeah. So they announced this. Of course, people were angry, understandably, and Twitter kind of blew up. And, you know, and maybe I shouldn't, I throughout this have given the RWA so much benefit of the doubt, more than I think they probably deserve, to be honest.
Well, but sometimes it's like, it helps to show just how bad things are, of like even giving people all of the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
It's still bad.
Yeah. I mean, because they didn't do anything about it. And I thought, surely they won't let this book win. Like,
that's what I thought was happening. I was like, okay, they must just not want to like get into it, but surely someone is going to step in and like keep this book from winning.
Yeah.
We did learn that night that the integrity of the vote in terms of like whoever gets voted seems to get the award. We did get validation there.
Yeah.
Don't let anyone win who gets
apparently. Well, although, okay, so, and I mean, we can talk about like some of the stuff with the judging that came out later. So all of this happens, they do the award ceremony July 31st, and At Love's Command wins for Inspirational Romance.
It sure does.
Which, as you said, we were on a live stream when this happened, and jaws dropped.
We were shocked but not surprised, if that makes sense.
Horrified.
Like, we were like, oh wow, they actually let this happen. Wow.
Yes. And that just kind of floored me. So of course, understandably, everybody was upset, and the president of the RWA initially came out kind of doubling down on this decision.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, I think a lot of what she said gets into the history of what inspirational romance is, which is interesting. I'm going to put a pin in that for a little bit later, but kind of doubling down on this, and among other things saying, all these people saw it and nobody had a problem with it, which, come to find out,
turns out
that was not the case. We know that there was at least one judge who had a problem with it, and when she spoke out, got removed from judging.
Mm-hmm. Which is a great way, it does solve your problems. If like someone is raising concerns, just don't like let them be involved anymore, and then you don't have anybody telling you not to do something. So much easier that way.
totally solves the problem. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I had somebody who commented on my vlog saying that she had judged inspirational romance, and because of formatting issues, because this is a whole other thing, like they gave us PDFs and not everybody, like I joined Kindle Unlimited so that I could have a better reading experience for the books I was judging. They were only required to give PDFs. So because of formatting issues, she said she couldn't read most of the books she was assigned and still judged them, I guess. And like, I don't know. Didn't quite understand the comment. It was a little,
Yeah, that seems like
so
a
I'm a little
weird way to
so I'm also a
proceed.
little concerned about like the validity of who anyway. So there's a lot of issues clearly going on here. But she kind of doubled down. And then, you know, outrage. And then what was it, a day or two
Yeah.
later? A day or two later.
Well, which is I know we're not doing the full RWA rundown,
I
but
know.
this is a classic RWA move, is that they
Yeah.
do something dumb, then they come out, like they refuse to say that it was dumb, they like double down, and then a day or two later when they don't like the response, then they try to backtrack. Which is basically what happened here. And I think they tried to say, like, the president, she was just speaking on her own behalf. We don't agree with this, and we are removing this award from the book,
Yes.
which is a good idea, but
Opens you up.
legally,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because I don't know why, because every competition I've ever seen does this, but they didn't build any language into the rules of the competition. They gave them a back door to be able to legally take away prizes for reasons like this. So they're opening themselves up to a potential lawsuit.
And again, we're not getting into their full history, but they're already in a pretty precarious financial situation from what we
Yeah.
can tell. And so between the number of people who have withdrawn their memberships in light of this debacle and possibly maybe getting sued, we're not lawyers, we don't know, but it seems like that's a possibility from what the speculation has been. Yeah, we may be seeing the end of this organization.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
through a series of I would call them unfortunate events, but it just seems like they just can't get out of their own way. So it's kind of, sometimes it's a little hard to feel bad for them because it's just like,
Yeah.
guys, come
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I guess I should say like outrage and also people who won awards returning their awards in
Mm-hmm.
protests was part of what happened. Okay, so this was the situation for anybody who wasn't following this closely.
Yes.
So now here and this is why Mara I wanted to talk to you because you do have so much background in this. Talk to people about what is inspirational romance, what is the history of inspirational romance, and like how did we get where we are? Basically.
Yeah. It's like, I want to, again, I'm going to try not to nerd out too much because I'm like, I literally wrote an entire thesis about this. So I want to be like, blah, like, here's, but in a nutshell, inspirational romance arose around the same time that kind of like modern romance emerged. So it's widely considered the first modern romance was Kathleen Woodiwis's The Flame and the Flower. And just a couple of years after that, the first inspirational romance came out, which was, I believe, Love Comes Softly by Janette Oakes, is considered to be the
Yeah.
first inspirational romance.
Which is so interesting. I definitely read that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's still it's a classic of that subgenre.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
basically the reason it's inspirational romance is honestly kind of coded language for romance novels written by and for evangelical women. With the rise of this popularity of romance that was, sexually explicit. And hey, I know when we look back in the 70s and 80s to the bodice rippers, today we would not see those as very liberating or very progressive, but in their moment, they were depicting women having and enjoying sex. And that was something pretty revolutionary in that time. I mean, it was kind of an outcropping of the sexual revolution of the 60s. And so it's sort of continuing that trajectory. And so conservative evangelicals do not want women reading about sex on page necessarily. They definitely don't want unmarried women reading about that. So this sort of response is, okay, how can we make a version of romance that is sexually not explicit And this is where we could get into like really a whole tangent. There's this rich tradition within evangelicalism of what I would probably describe as didactic fiction, where evangelicalism is a highly literature-based subculture. Like, and Bethany, you're aware of this because you come out of it, but there's this expectation that you're always reading things. Like, you're always reading kind of lay devotionals, you're reading lay theology, or just something related to your spirituality. Like, that is a huge part of evangelicalism. So this kind of fiction is really sort of like a natural outgrowth of that already existing like book culture.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to think about. I mean, I would argue that it is in some ways an interesting feminist tension that gets introduced into evangelical subculture, because we now have women writing for other women, and in a conservative culture that where women are not allowed to speak, they are not allowed to teach. We now have women essentially teaching other women. If you ask evangelical women how they think about this reading, they will very frequently talk about this as a devotional act. So it's not just, and this gets into this controversy, it's not just that it is Christian fiction in the sense of it's not sexually explicit. If there is any kind of on the page, sexy times, it is always going to be between married people, or it's going to be explicitly condemned as like sinful and bad if it's not within the bonds of marriage. It's not just that. It also is meant to have some kind of spiritually enriching themes and devotional element to it.
Yep.
So that's where some of these controversies and these content things get particularly problematic, and why. So the statement that the president got in trouble for was basically saying like, hey, this fiction has a redemption arc, like that's a part of this subgenre. And people got really mad at her for saying that, but honestly, she's not wrong. In terms of like the history of this subgenre, that is a huge part of how these books are supposed to work. So anyway, that's like Cliff Notes version of like the history of inspirational fiction.
Yeah, which is it's really interesting, because one thing that I hadn't thought about until I saw somebody else talking about this in a video a few months ago was, similar to what you were talking about as inspirational romance being evangelical Christianity's answer to the romance genre. Like, looking back, other things I was reading, like Frank Peretti and
oh my gosh, this coming darkness.
But like Frank Peretti, and who was the other?
Timothy LaHaye, like the Left Behind.
Oh yeah.
Like that whole sort of like apocalyptic fiction tradition.
Right.
There's been
Well, but I think specifically Frank Peretti, and there's why can't I think of his name now? There's another guy who is still writing. Oh, Ted Decker.
Okay. Oh yeah. With the two Ks, which I always was.
Yeah. So what I think is interesting is that I think Frank Peretti and Ted Decker were kind of evangelical Christianity's answer to Stephen King. I heard somebody say that, and I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And similarly, they were horror novels with spiritual devotional themes to them. And and it's interesting looking back, because a lot of what I read was either like classics or these sort of evangelical versions of fiction subgenres.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much at our school. That was sort of you were either reading sort of like literature, or you were reading Christian fiction. Like that was sort of what was acceptable. And, there was like a couple of times like people would, start reading some like Mary Higgins Clark on the side, like, ooh, scandalous. But in general, like those were really the two main things that you were reading fiction wise.
Yeah. I think so I went, and the thing is like, I was in a more liberal area of the country. So like,
that's a good point. Because I grew up in the Bible Belt and you grew up in
I was in Oregon, like Portland, like outskirts of Portland for this period of my life. And so like the controversial thing that like half of us could read and half of us couldn't was Harry Potter.
That was very controversial. So in my circle, we read Harry Potter, but it was a very divisive issue at our school because there were parents who it wasn't in our library, for example, because there were a lot of parents who felt like it was dark-sided.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. It wasn't in our library
Yeah.
either. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just interesting. And I don't, you know what, it would be interesting to go back and look too, because I actually am remembering there was a little series of books, and I don't remember who wrote them, but they were also, I know we're talking about romance, but like they were also Christian horror, and they had like for teens, and like one of them was about aliens, but the aliens ended up being demons and people thought they were aliens. And like it was
Yeah,
like,
that checks out. I mean, like sounds like kind of maybe like Goosebumps or
yeah, but
what was it? Metamorphosis. Do you remember those books? Like where they
Animorphs, like
Animorphs, yeah,
Animorphs.
like it sounds like maybe
Yeah.
those kinds of ideas. But
Yeah, I think it was like those, but Christian.
there are some hilarious Christian movie trailers out there where like it is basically horror, but instead of like a monster, they are demons. And I'll try to find one to send to you because it is
Okay.
honestly one of the funniest things I've ever
Oh,
seen.
oh my gosh. Yeah, but at the time I thought it was terrifying. I mean, as a young person, I was like, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
like this is how the world is." So, okay, so this is the thing, moving pivoting back to romance as the like
Yeah.
topic of this is, I think having gone back and reread some of the things that I loved when I was a teenager, I think the things that really stood out to me reading them now were, like you said, kind of this redemption arc of having, even like there's a very, very popular, don't hate me, people who are listening, but there is a very popular, still popular book, Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers.
Yeah,
And
it's pretty horrifying, honestly. Like,
yeah, it's a lot. I mean, but I
but
loved
it was
it, and
beloved. I mean, people love
oh,
it.
people still love it. And one of the things with that is that there is a redemption arc for our heroine's brother-in-law who sexually assaults her. And then he has a redemption arc, not a very good one, where he ends up like marrying a sweet young virginal woman at the end of the book.
Yeah, and I mean, he assaults her, and I'm not going to say the book approves of it, and I'm not going to say the book necessarily says it's her fault, but I'm also not going to say that it goes to any pains to make that clear that, like, because in the book, she's a sex worker,
Yeah.
and there is a kind of feeling I feel from the narrator that is very patronizing or very whatever, like, oh, this poor little sex worker, she knows not what she does. That's kind of the vibe. And
Mhm.
so there is I don't know. I feel like there is somewhat of a feeling or an insinuation that because she's a sex worker, she has to kind of expect that she might get assaulted. Like that's a result of her choice to be a sex worker, which is, I'm sure, what I thought when I was an evangelical.
Yeah.
But now looking back on it,
It's
is awful.
horrific. Well, but
Yeah.
I mean, it really tracks though with this evangelical idea of putting the burden of purity on women.
Yes.
Where it's, if like like how many times we were talked to about modesty, and the importance of modesty was to not cause your brother to stumble, because if a man is being lustful, it's your fault because you weren't
Yes.
modest enough, which I have so many problems with now, but
Well,
that's
it's this kind of Madonna whore type messaging towards girls where you are both like, women don't want sex, women don't, they give sex because their husbands want it.
right.
At the same time, this idea of like, well, all women are like tempt pots of temptation that are
Right.
just there to cause men to sin, and they're
Yep.
using their sexuality to manipulate men. So it's like
It's
this
weird.
very
Yeah.
dichotomous message that always leads back to women's pleasure not being important, to women's choices not mattering in the context of sex,
Right.
and women not having any kind of encouragement to uh, consider their own desire, pleasure, sexuality. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously, conservative evangelicalism is very compet towards everyone, but women are definitely included in
Oh,
that.
yeah. No, 100%. Well, and I mean, I think this is part of why, like, I was 30 before I was like, oh, maybe I'm not quite as straight as I thought I was for most of my life, is because of
Mm-hmm.
that, because I just thought, and maybe was told at some point explicitly, that like it's normal for women to sometimes be attracted to other women. That's just a thing. It doesn't mean anything. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I mean, like I am happily married in a monogamous marriage with a man. I have been for like 10 years now, but I think that was an interesting journey of like coming to realize that so late in life. And I know I'm not alone. I've heard so many women
Mm-hmm.
with similar stories, because especially if you're bisexual or pansexual, like there's this just assumption of like, well, if you're attracted to men,
Fine, good.
what's so good?
You don't have
That's
to worry
great.
about
What's the
this.
problem? Like
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah,
problem.
because if you
Yeah.
are gay, often in the conservative evangelical world, you are counseled to essentially, even if not everybody endorses conversion therapy anymore, some people definitely still do, but
Mhm.
some don't.
Yeah.
They still definitely encourage you to like, well, you can be gay and a Christian, but you can't act on it. So like,
Right.
if you have a way to not even have to deal with this, like bypass this
Then
whole issue,
great.
like just do that.
Like you are in good shape then.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man. Yeah.
Well, and it's not even, I think people who don't grow up in that mindset, and maybe, you know, with the internet, people I think are more aware of kind of what people get taught or have more awareness of it.
Hmm.
But it's been a fun game for me throughout my life to like drop the little nuggets of like, oh yeah, like did you have chapel every 6 weeks to essentially shame all of you about how your boobs were leading men into hell? No, just me
Yeah.
when I was 15.
Oh,
Great. But like
yeah,
even just
sure.
things like masturbation, like
Oh, yeah.
that is by and large considered to be a sin. So even just
Yeah.
like
There's like
pleasure
so much
with your own
shame.
body is
Yeah.
so shamed and
Yeah.
so, you know, that's part, I mean, secular romance is essentially seen as porn
Yep.
by evangelical Christianity,
Yeah.
because it has any kind of description of sex
Yeah.
that is could potentially be titillating.
Well, I think what's interesting to me too, looking back, is one of the books that got published as I was a teenager was this series of like Every Man's Battle, Every Woman's Battle.
Yes, yep.
And
Every girl's
and
battle, every boy's
right, yeah, yeah,
battle.
yeah, yeah. So what's interesting is in the woman's version of it, one of the things they did actually talk about romance novels, and essentially kind of place it as like, if you are married and you're reading romance novels, you are cheating on your spouse. Like that's
Interesting.
yeah.
Well, and I mean, yeah, because any kind of fantasy
Mhm,
or visualization of a sexual scenario that doesn't involve your spouse
mhm.
is by and large considered to be sinful.
Yeah.
So romance, which is interesting because when I was doing my paper, like I was trying to dig up any kind of stats I could, and I should caveat because I was writing in the early to mid teens, and a lot of the literature I was looking at comes from probably 2009-ish. So I want to
Yeah.
caveat it's probably a little out of date by now. But at the time I was looking at it, statistically, women who read secular romances report higher satisfaction with their partners than women who
Hmm.
don't. Because they're more likely to appreciate sort of like the romantic elements of their partner or like to see their partner in a romantic light.
Hmm.
And they're more likely to initiate sex with their partner than women who don't. Whereas evangelical women who read inspirational romances are statistically less happy in their partnerships
Yeah.
than women who don't read any romance or who read secular romance. And that's because part of the narrative that's pushed in inspirational romance is that the man is supposed to both be kind of your traditional romance hero where he's like sexy and, you know,
Hmm.
like I want to, you know, like appealing to some,
Yeah.
you know, romantically appealing. But then he is also supposed to be Jesus, basically. Like he's
Right.
supposed to be this leader, this perfect leader who like leads his woman to righteousness and
Hmm.
whatever. And when women compare, like no man can do that. Like that,
Hmm.
it's an impossible standard. For as much as people give romance novels in general kind of a rap of like idealizing relationships, like most secular romances show flawed people finding a way to be happy together.
Mhm.
Whereas, and they're not explicitly didactic. Whereas inspirational romances are explicitly didactic, and they're showing you a man who is like impossibly perfect. So of
Right.
course, then when you're looking at your relationship, you're like, well, my husband doesn't, hold my hand and lead me in prayer every night and help me figure out like how to, whatever.
Right.
And he's, doesn't know how to, pleasure me potentially because he's never had any meaningful sex education having to do with, pleasure
Mhm.
aside from just like tab A into slot B, So
Yeah.
anyway, I just think it is interesting to think
That's interesting.
through.
Yeah. Well, and
It's not doing, I think, what they hope it is.
no, I don't think so. Well, and I think the other version of a hero is one who has a redemption arc and
Mhm.
like an
Yeah.
inspirational romance. And often in that case, part of what leads to his redemption is the woman being perfect.
Yeah, it's like
So,
that's a good point. One of the two people in the relationship basically has to be perfect
yeah.
because one of the two people has to have this redemption arc.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's either and I think that's the thing is like the women having a redemption arc is like often them being like wild and spontaneous, having to learn how to be more calm and like restrained. Like that's their
Mhm.
redemption arc.
Yeah. Or, I mean, like, you know what? Okay, The Knight and the Dove by Laurie Wick. This is one that we all loved when I was in middle school.
Yeah.
And she actually is a pretty unusual inspirational heroine. Now that I'm thinking about this, I want to say I've not read this book in years, so like I'm not necessarily
Yeah.
endorsing this, but my memory of it is that she's sort of like the younger redheaded sassy sister in like medieval Scotland.
Yeah.
And she is also an evangelical Christian, which is also kind of hilarious. Like they always have evangelical Christians, like no matter what the time period. And I'm like,
Yeah.
evangelicalism is a manifestation of Christianity that came with the Enlightenment. So like there were no evangelical Christians in
But Mara,
Scotland
you
in
don't
medieval.
care about historical accuracy, remember?
That is a fact. Okay, yes. But these are books like that are purporting, they're very
Yeah.
specifically trying. That's
Yeah,
what I
yeah.
always come back to. I'm like, I do hold inspirational romance to a slightly different standard because I'm like, y'all are trying to teach people something. Like that is explicitly a part of your mission
Right.
statement. So, but anyway, she converts her heathen husband through sensuous massages after he's been jousting. And I remember being very like scandalized by that as a 7th grader.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, it's funny. One of the books that I reread a few years back was part of that series, but it was one of the more like Victorian eras.
The Hawk and the Jewel?
The Hawk and the Jewel, which
Yes.
oh my goodness. Like,
oh wow. Yeah, that was like one of my main texts in my thesis because I was like,
oh,
holy imperialism, Batman.
well,
Like, what is going
imperialism
on?
and like grooming a child.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
it was
she's
so
like an actual
disturbing.
child.
She's like, I think 11 or 12 years old when they meet, and he's significantly older. And by the time they get together, she's like 16. And like,
It's okay. It's the 1800s.
oh my God, but it's so disturbing. Like it
And it's
reads
not
like
daddy
grooming.
because that maybe if
No.
there was
But
Christian
but you know
romance
what?
that
But
had daddy kink,
no.
if you know that book, let us know because that would be an interesting book.
But not with an actual child. So,
yeah, maybe not with
I
an
mean,
actual.
no. Yeah. No, but
Yeah.
well, and in some ways it does. Like the thing is like he acts like a parent to her. Like the way he talks to her is like a parent. So it's very uncomfortable. Rereading that, I was like, whoa.
Paternalism, you gotta love it. But I mean, like that's the game. She needs his guidance because she's been off in the you can't see if you're listening to podcasts, but heathen, quote unquote, heathen lands.
Right.
And she has to be brought back into the Jesus fold. So
yes. Yep. Yeah.
But we should mention, so we've been talking, this was occasioned by a specific scandal, which was with genocide of Native Americans. Right. But this is not the first time that these awards have had this problem, because when I was in the middle of writing my thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget the name of this book. It doesn't deserve to be mentioned by name, but there was a inspirational romance. I don't remember if it won, but it definitely was in the finals, where it's a romance between, I can't believe I'm saying these words out loud, a Nazi officer at a death camp, at a concentration camp, and a Jewish prisoner of that concentration camp. And it is meant to be a retelling of the Book of Esther.
Yeah.
Much as Redeeming Love is a retelling of Hosea.
Yep.
And if you, Christian women who read these books where they're retellings of biblical stories, it's like doubly disturbing, because it's not only that it's horrifying on the level of like, holy shit, you have a romance with a happily ever after with a literal Nazi and a Jewish prisoner. But also, this is spiritual instruction about their holy text. Like, they are using what they're learning from this book to interpret a book of their holy text. So, I mean, on the one hand, I'm like, women teaching women about the Bible, that's feminist, but maybe not with Nazis. Like, maybe not, or not with like sex workers who were sexually enslaved as children. Like, I don't know, maybe not with those things.
And, you know, like, maybe we teach each other about, like, Jael, who, like, seduced someone and then killed the enemy by driving a tent peg through his temple. Like, that's a cool story. Like, I guess that's the thing, is, like, but nobody talks about those women. And so this is the interesting thing to me, is that, like, I've come to realize that I think a lot of times evangelical Christianity likes to pick and choose the biblical heroines that they sort of lionize in these stories.
Or if we're going to talk about sex workers, what about Tamara, who was like, you know what, Judah, you owe me a baby, so I'm going to pretend to be a sex worker on the side of the road, and when you go to this sex worker, you're going to give me your fucking semen so that I can have a baby. How about that? And I'm going to be one of the great grandmothers of Jesus.
Well, or Rahab, who was also a sex worker. There's a lot of sex workers in the Bible. There's a lot of
sex.
Like
in
God
the
loves
Bible, you're either a sex worker or a mom. That's pretty much your option.
Well, I mean, but the thing that's interesting to me is, like, they're not, you know, I mean, it's not necessarily like portrayed as like positive all the time, but also like,
it's kind of a mixed bag.
It's kind of a mixed bag. And I feel like there is a way, like, there's a reading of the Old Testament where you could be like, God is hella feminist, and the problem is these white men who have interpreted the Bible as not being that way. Anyway, this is my, like, my journey out of evangelicalism has been a lot of this kind of stuff of, like, thinking through
or I mean, I think I've come to different conclusions, but I like your reading better than the ones I grew up with, so I'll definitely take that over the ones that I got.
Fair enough. But I mean, regardless, I do think it's interesting that there is some, like, picking and choosing of who are we going to talk about and use as a moment of teaching. And it's the few heroines of the Bible who are, well, I don't know if they even are, but they can be spun, I guess you could say, as being more submissive and gentle, and, like, I don't know, like, you can spin it into, like, into the ideas of what you want. What you think
like
you want
Ruth.
I
think that Ruth is often portrayed as a very, like, meek, submissive to her mother-in-law. Like, that's kind of the vibe. But then when you really think about what she does, she literally, like, goes in the middle of the night and, like, offers herself basically sexually to a man because her mother-in-law told her to. So it's like, if my mother-in-law told me to, like, how far does submission go? Like, if we're like, would you approve of that in today's context? And it's like, oh, but it's in the Bible, so it was fine. But I think that's what's, I don't know. I think stepping away from the faith of my youth, I'm able to see many of those stories in a new light and think, I think, you know, reading the Bible as a how-to book is a very limiting lens through which to view this text, and I think you're very selective about where it is a how-to book versus where it is metaphorical. So
I will also just say, with Ruth, I was definitely in Bible study classes where the question of what she was actually doing came up, and the teacher was
Oh,
like
yeah.
adamantly like, no, she would never have done that. She was just laying at his feet. It was just a thing they did culturally. This was I'm like, no, that was not
A
at
thing
all.
they did culturally to like get it on, but yeah, like I mean,
Nope. Yeah.
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 But
So
anyway, I mean, I don't want to yuck anyone's yum when it comes
no.
to religion. Like, if it's still working for people, I'm
Yeah.
not trying to, but I'm just saying, I think part of the problem with inspirational romance in particular,
Yeah.
and inspirational fiction writ large, is that because it's so focused on being didactic,
Mhm.
it begs the question of like, what is it you're teaching?
Right.
And that's where, if you're not in the in group of who is going to receive this lesson in a very specific way, some of these lessons that are being imparted to non in group tastes
Mhm.
can seem pretty horrifying. And I think it is interesting, kind of having been in the in group and now looking in from the outside a little bit, having just a very different perspective on what you're supposed to take from some of these stories that to the in group seem like, oh, that's such a beautiful lesson, and to the out, like to the in group, oh, anybody can be redeemed.
Right.
That's so beautiful. To the out group, it's like, I don't want to read about a Nazi being redeemed in my romance.
Yeah.
I just don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think one thing I do want to clarify with this, kind of a caveat of this, is that, when we're talking about inspirational romance, there, a lot of what we're talking about is white evangelical inspirational romance. And
Which is where it comes from
yeah,
originally, but
but
I think I know where you're going with this,
yeah,
and I agree.
yeah, but there are some, like, for instance, Black authors like Piper Hughley, for instance, who write
Mm-hmm.
inspirational romance that I think still has some of those spiritual elements to it, but don't tend to have the same toxic issues that show up
Or
in.
at least they're they yeah, I think that you're much more likely to find a book that is not interested in being purely didactic on some level. Like, I think that non-white inspirationals tend to be more about like representing a part of somebody's life in fiction versus teaching about Christianity.
Mhm.
It's more like, hey, these are stories about people for whom spirituality is very important, and like
Right.
that's a manifestation of their character and like in their life, like, so that's represented on the page,
Yeah.
versus the lesson imparting is often less prescriptive, holier, like it doesn't have the same sort of like devotional element to it often, and
Yeah.
therefore could be palatable, I think, to people who are not in the in group
Yes.
more so than white evangelical
Yeah.
inspirational romance.
Yeah. And I mean, I will also say, like, depending on the author, there's also some Amish romances that to me read more like what you're talking about. Maybe not all of them, but some of the more modern ones.
There is like a subgenre of like romantic suspense Amish romance that I think is more readable because
Yeah.
it's more like external conflict
Yeah.
driven.
Yeah. Well, and like I've read a couple of things by Patricia Davids who like they have faith, but like that's not the focus. They just happen to be Amish and it's more of like your traditional like non-sexy romance with good
Yeah.
characters. So I think it
Yeah.
depends on the author. But yeah, it is it is a specific type that we're talking about. And I also think it's worth noting that inspirational romance has a lot of overlap with what you could call like sweet or proper romance that just doesn't have explicit sex on the page. Like there's a lot of
For
overlap, but they're
sure.
not always the same thing. There are lines of romance that, are non-explicit but more secular. So,
Yeah, there are plenty of people who don't want to read about sex on the page. I don't understand that life, but there's plenty of that. So like, if there are people who just don't want to read about that, or like it makes them uncomfortable, or maybe it does, contradict their particular faith tradition or their
yeah.
moral convictions, like that's fair enough. And there's plenty of non-explicit romance out there that doesn't have the same kind of like moral
Yeah.
Again, I keep going back to didactic. It doesn't have that didactic element to it. It's purely just like, hey, I want a romance that doesn't have anything explicit in it.
Right, right. Yeah. And I like a blend. I read some steamier romance and I like to mix in some things that aren't. So like Vanessa Riley is great if you want somebody who isn't. I also have done some work with Shadow Mountain Publishing and they have a proper romance line, and those books also tend to not really be religious. They're just not steamy, and those can be fun. So like there are places to go if that's something you want. Or like the Harlequin love inspired line. Not all of them, but a lot of those tend to be pretty good.
And there are some Christian publishers who have a line of non-Christian romance that is also not explicit, and they're kind of what they see as more crossover titles for them.
Yeah.
So even there are some Christian publishers who have non-inspirational romance, but they are still non-explicit. So it's sort of interesting because it is Christian in the sense of who is publishing it.
Yeah.
But the books themselves don't necessarily have like a didactic element to them.
Right. Which is interesting. Well, and similarly, like Shadow Mountain Publishing, their parent company is Mormon, but I think they're like the imprint that does more sort of widely secular titles, if that makes sense. So it's kind of
exactly. And like Thomas Nelson and like a few of those other Christian publishers have a similar kind of line somewhere. Yeah.
Which makes sense. So, throwing that out there for everybody, there's, and I mean, I don't read a lot of this stuff now. I don't know. Well, I was gonna say maybe things have gotten better, but then we're talking about Love's Command.
No, I mean, I think that there's better quality these days. Like, I think you have more books that are better executed. But I think because not even just inspirational romance, but Christian fiction in general has to have that didactic element or that like devotional element. And it is very hard to have books that have like widespread appeal if that's one of your primary goals in the text. Right. I think it's limiting. Whereas, again, I mean, this full circle back to my thesis, like Jane Eyre is a book that has a lot of spiritual and theological concerns in it, but its mission is not to preach. That's just a part of the overall artistic vision it has. Right. And I think it's difficult if one of the fundamental raison d'etre of a book is to preach. It's just going to be hard for a lot of people to be super psyched to read a whole book of that.
Yeah.
Who are not already kind of bought in.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting, and I don't know. I think one other thing that I did want to mention with At Love's Command, which is the book that kind of sparked the conversation in the first place, it's worth noting that it is intended to be the first book in a series where
just can't get enough.
Yeah, so where the hero has friends from his platoon who are the heroes of further books, and one of them apparently is going to have a biracial heroine, so I'm sure that's going to be handled so well. That was sarcasm.
I won't be there to find out, but God bless anybody who has to read that who's not white.
Yeah.
Well, before we leave the topic, I do want to give a couple of reading, like nonfiction shout outs if people are interested in reading more about this subgenre.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Kind of like the seminal text of this area, this subgenre is called Romancing God, Evangelical Women and Inspirational Fiction by Lynn Neal. And it's a sociological study about like the function of inspirational fiction for evangelical women. It's a little old, but it's still, I think, pretty widely referenced. There is one called The Thrill of the Chaste, like Chaste.
I get it.
The Allure of Amish Romance Novels by Valerie Weaver Zerker. So that one's about Amish romance.
Very interesting.
And then kind of a general Christian fiction, like examining Christian or inspirational fiction in general, is Faith and Fiction by Anita Gandolfo. So if people are interested in this topic and they're nerds like me and are interested in some nonfiction,
Yeah, we'll have that all
There you go.
linked in the show notes. So before we move on to talking about upcoming releases, the one kind of final thing I wanted to talk about here is given all of this, what can or should the RWA do moving forward, assuming that they continue and have another, like a second year of the Vivian?
I think that they should not have this category because I think that it's intrinsically set up to be for, I think their goal was to have it just be religious fiction writ large, but it's very hard if it's a genre that comes from a specific place to get away from those roots and to have a broader readership. Because the reality is that most of the people who are reading these kinds of books are white evangelical women. Now, I'd say that's followed by Black Christian women. That definitely exists, but I think the vast majority are white conservative evangelical women. So even if you try to have books that are like Jewish romances, like, can you imagine what you or I would have thought of the Intimacy Experiment?
Oh no.
When we were, you know what I mean? So like, I don't know that the readership and therefore like the judging panel would ever be really fairly stacked for books that don't come out of this very specific worldview. So I say, oh, this is what we talked about. This is what I think they should do. Since they already have an erotic romance category, we were talking about how they should just nix the religious bit and just have generally like a sweet romance or like a non-explicit romance category that has no specific religious element to it. And it's just like, hey, any book that doesn't have
explicit
on page.
Yeah.
This, or,
I think that makes
but I
a
think
lot
the
more
religious
sense.
thing's gotta go.
No,
Like, I just don't think it's working.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like leave that to religious organizations to give awards for that, I think. And then, they can enter into that category, but it would broaden it. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Well, who knows if the RWA will hear or take any advice, but we could solve all the world's problems.
Yeah, exactly. Just put us in charge and we'll fix it all for you. But I think that's the only viable route to have any kind of category like that. But I think the religious, I just don't see how this is ever going to stop being a problem. So if you don't want to have this problem, don't have that category.
Yep. I agree. Cool. Well, thanks for doing this. This was this was fun. You were good.
We got into it.
We did, yeah. Okay, so lastly, we're going to get into On My Radar, where I'll share recent or upcoming book releases in sci-fi, fantasy, and romance that I'm excited about, and then Mara will have the opportunity to share one as well. The books for today's episode will be released between August 31st and September 13th, with the exception of the guest recommendation, which may include any upcoming release. So I've got a few. August 31st, we've got The Heart Principle by Helen Huang, which has been very anticipated. I see Mara like
I've read it.
I know, I saw your review of it. I want to read it.
It's very good, but for people who like romance, I will tell you, I think please do some research about the content warnings and please know that it's not really a romance. It's more sort of general fiction with romantic elements, which is a change from the rest of the series. So like, I like this book, but I just want to make sure people go into it with the right expectations because I think it could go very badly if you didn't.
Yeah, I could see that. That said, if you're interested,
yes, I still recommend it. It's good.
Yeah. This one follows violinist Anna's son, who accidentally achieves career success with a viral YouTube video and finds herself incapacitated and burned out from her attempts to replicate that moment. When her longtime boyfriend announces he wants an open relationship before making a final commitment, a hurt and angry Anna decides, your face, is this not what happens? This is the description of the book.
I mean, it is, but it's just interesting that they clearly are trying to pitch it as a romance when that's like not. This is like the first 5 pages of the book.
Okay. So it says, a hurt and angry Anna decides if he wants an open relationship, then she does too. But her attempts at a one-night stand with Quan fail because being with him is more than just sex. So that's kind of
that is true.
Yeah, there you go. So that's coming out August 31st. And then I've got 3 books for September 7th. First is The Inheritance of Orchidea Divina by Zareta Cordova. This is said to be a gorgeously written novel about a family searching for the truth hidden in their past and the power they've inherited. I'm excited about this. This is her adult fantasy debut. It's Latinx inspired fantasy. Looking forward to it. The cover is beautiful. Then we have The Girls Are Never Gone by Sarah Glenn Marsh. This is a YA sapphic ghost story following a girl with a paranormal investigation podcast who visits the haunted Arrington estate where 30 years ago a teenager drowned in the lake. So
that should be fun.
Yeah.
Description. Yeah.
Yeah. And then lastly is The Bones of Ruin by Sarah, I don't know if it's Raleigh or Roffley, but this is about an African tightrope dancer in Victorian London, a girl named Iris who's used to being strange. She is certainly a strange sight for leering British audiences, always eager for the spectacle of colonial curiosity. But Iris also has a secret that even strange doesn't capture. She cannot die. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty high premise. Yeah.
So those are ones I'm interested in. Mara, do you have anything people should know about?
Yes. Okay. So I'm looking through my September reading. So my favorite book that I have read in advance this year, period, comes out on September 14th, and it is The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. It is a freaking delight. Okay, so it's just trope candy for me. It's fake dating. It's main characters in STEM. They're both biologists. He's a world-renowned biology professor. She is a student. She's a PhD student, but she's not his PhD student. So you get like you get like the kind of hint of professor student, but without the awful power dynamic issues.
Okay, I like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
They go to a conference where there's not only one bed, but they are sharing a hotel room. So that's exciting. He is a grump. She is sunshine. And they're just adorable. It started its life as Kylo, like Rilo, or what is it? Kylo Ren,
Raylo.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. Yeah. And I just love this book. The writing is so light and lovely. Like, it's a debut. It's a great debut. I definitely want to read more from the author. It has workplace sexual harassment, so content warning there, but it has like probably one of the most satisfying endings to that kind of a scenario ever. And I was just like, yes.
Awesome.
So I freaking love this book. And if you look on Goodreads, it's like nothing but raves. I think this is going to be one that pretty much everybody, if you like those tropes, if that's your thing, it's a crowd pleaser.
Awesome. That sounds great. Check it out, everybody. Thank you. This was fun. Again, this has been Chapter 3 Podcast. I'm your host, Bethany. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Chapter 3 Podcast, and you can find me on YouTube at Beautifully Bookish Bethany. The next episode will be available in 2 weeks, and this episode's bonus content will be available to patrons in the next few days. Thanks for listening.